The November rain hammered against the windows of Rosewood Funeral Home in downtown Chicago, each drop echoing the hollow feeling in Elena Martinez's chest. The sound was relentless, drumming against the glass like the persistent ache of grief that had settled in her bones 3 days ago when the hospital called. She sat in the front row, her black dress still damp from the sprint across the parking lot, watching as strangers filed past her father's casket with practiced sympathy. Roberto Martinez had been many things: a demanding father, a successful contractor, a man who built half the commercial buildings on the South Side, but he'd never been one for crowds. The funeral home smelled of lilies and furniture polish, that distinctive combination that Elena would forever associate with loss. She'd chosen this place because it was where her mother's service had been held 12 years ago, though Roberto had complained then about the expense. Maria would have wanted something simple, he'd said, but Elena had insisted. Now, looking at the elaborate flower arrangements her siblings had ordered, she wondered if they were trying to make up for something. Guilt, perhaps, or the years of distance they'd put between themselves and the man in the mahogany casket. He would have hated this, Elena whispered to herself, adjusting the silver locket around her neck that contained his photo from better days. Behind her, she could hear the familiar voices of her siblings cutting through the murmur of condolences. Marcus, her older brother, was already working the room like the politician he'd become, his expensive suit and practiced smile making him look more like he was campaigning than mourning. His wife, Jennifer, stood beside him, her perfectly manicured, nails clicking against her phone screen as she typed what Elena assumed were work emails. The numbers from the Henderson project came in, Marcus was saying quietly to their middle brother, David. Dad's company is worth more than we thought. Way more. David nodded, his construction worker's hands fidgeting with his tie. Unlike Marcus, who'd abandoned the family business for politics, David had stayed to work alongside their father, learning every aspect of Martinez construction from the ground up. The contracts alone are worth millions, and that's not counting the properties. Elena's stomach twisted. Even here, even now, it was about money. She thought about the conversation she'd had with Roberto just 2 weeks ago, when she'd visited him in the hospital. He'd been sitting up in bed, looking frail in his blue gown, but still sharp-eyed, still alert. They'd talked about her work at the community center, about the families she was helping find housing, about everything except the elephant in the room, his declining health and what would happen to his empire when he was gone. You know, Mija, he'd said, taking her hand in his weathered one, success isn't about what you accumulate. It's about what you leave behind that makes the world better. At the time, she'd thought he was just being philosophical, the way old men often got when they sensed time running short. Now she wondered if he'd been trying to tell her something more specific. She turned slightly, catching sight of her sister Carmen near the back of the room. Carmen had flown in from Los Angeles that morning, her designer sunglasses pushed up, on her head despite the gloomy weather. Her Botox-smooth forehead and perfectly styled blonde hair made her look younger than her 42 years. But Elena could see the stress lines around her eyes that no amount of cosmetic work could hide. Carmen's husband, Richard, stood beside her, looking uncomfortable in his expensive suit, constantly checking his phone and whispering urgent conversations to people who apparently couldn't wait until after the funeral to discuss whatever crisis was consuming his attention. She was deep in conversation with a man Elena didn't recognize. Tall, silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. That's Dad's lawyer, David continued, following Elena's gaze. Carmen's been talking to him all morning, says there are some complications with the will. Elena's blood ran cold. She'd been dreading this conversation, but she'd hoped it would at least wait until after they'd buried their father. Roberto Martinez had been in the ground for exactly 47 minutes. What kind of complications? Marcus asked, his political instincts kicking in. He'd learned long ago that information was power, and power was everything. The kind that might require us to be very careful about how we handle things, David replied cryptically. Carmen thinks Elena might try to contest the will. You know how she was always Dad's favorite." Elena felt her face flush. Favorite? She'd been the one who'd stayed close to home, who'd visited him every Sunday for dinner, who'd held his hand in the hospital during his final weeks. But she'd also been the one who'd refused to join the family business, choosing instead to become a social worker, a decision that had created a rift between them that never fully healed. "You're too smart to waste your life on other people's problems," Roberto had said when she'd announced her major in college. Family business is what builds dynasties. But Elena had seen too many families destroyed by money, had watched her own siblings become strangers competing for their father's approval. She'd wanted to help people, to make a difference in individual lives rather than just accumulate wealth and property. The irony wasn't lost on her that her choice to help others had somehow made her Roberto's favorite, while her siblings' attempts to follow in his footsteps had driven them apart. Marcus had gotten into politics partly to help the family business, but had ended up so caught up in the power games that he'd forgotten why he'd started. David had stayed with the company but had grown resentful of Roberto's exacting standards and micromanagement. Carmen had fled to California, claiming she needed space to find herself, but everyone knew she'd really just wanted to escape the weight of family expectations. The funeral director, a thin man with kind eyes, approached Elena with a gentle touch to her shoulder. "Ms. Martinez, I'm so sorry for your loss. Your father spoke of you often when he was making arrangements." "He made his own arrangements?" Elena asked, surprised. "Oh yes, very detailed ones. He was quite specific about certain things." The director glanced around nervously. "He asked that I give you this personally." He handed her a small envelope with her name written in her father's distinctive handwriting. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind Roberto used for important business documents. Elena's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a small brass key. The note was brief. "Mia, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you're probably surrounded by vultures. The key opens the bottom drawer of my desk at home. Inside, you'll find what you need to know. The combination is the same as always. The date you graduated social work school. The day I was proudest of you, even if I never said it. Trust no one but yourself. I made sure you'd be protected. Con amor." Papa Elena's heart pounded as she read the note twice, then carefully folded it back into the envelope. She could feel the weight of the brass key in her palm, warm from her grip. The combination he'd mentioned, U5-1519, was burned into her memory. May 15th, 2019. The day she'd graduated from Northwestern with her master's in social work. She remembered Roberto sitting in the auditorium, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as she walked across the stage. It had been one of the few times she'd seen him cry since her mother's death. "I know we haven't always agreed, mija," he'd said that night over dinner at their favorite Mexican restaurant. "But today, watching you up there, I realized something. You chose to help people when you could have chosen to make money. That takes more courage than I ever had." It had been the closest thing to an apology she'd ever received from him. An acknowledgement that maybe her path had been the right one after all. "What's that?" he asked, moving closer. "Just a note," Elena replied, slipping the envelope into her purse. "Personal stuff." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Elena, I think we need to talk, all of us, about Dad's estate." "Can it wait?" Elena asked, though she already knew the answer. "Unfortunately, no," Carmen said, appearing at Marcus's side with the silver-haired lawyer in tow. "There are some urgent matters that need to be addressed. Mr. Henderson here has been Dad's attorney for 15 years. He has some concerns about the will." Mr. Henderson cleared his throat. "Ms. Martinez, I don't want to intrude on your grief, but there are some irregularities in your father's estate planning that need immediate attention. He made some unusual changes in his final months." Elena stood up, feeling suddenly claustrophobic. "What kind of changes? Perhaps we should discuss this privately." Henderson suggested, glancing around at the other mourners. No, Carmen said firmly. We're family. We don't have secrets. Elena almost laughed at the irony. The Martinez family had been built on secrets, layer upon layer of them, like the foundation of one of Roberto's buildings. She fingered the envelope in her purse, feeling the weight of whatever secret her father had left her. Your father created a trust, Henderson continued. But he also maintained control of certain assets through alternative means. There's a safe at the family home that contains important documents. The problem is, none of us have the combination. Can't we just crack it? David asked. It's a military-grade safe, Henderson replied. Your father was very security conscious. We'd need to bring in specialists, and that could take weeks. Meanwhile, there are time-sensitive business matters that need attention. Elena watched her. Siblings exchanged glances. She could practically see the gears turning in their heads, calculating how much money was at stake and how quickly they could get their hands on it. Where is this safe? Elena asked. In Dad's home office, Carmen replied. Behind the painting of the Virgin Mary. Very traditional hiding spot. We've already been to the house, Marcus added. Had to change the locks for security reasons. You understand. Elena's stomach dropped. You changed the locks? Without telling me? It's just temporary, David said quickly. Until we sort out the estate. You know how valuable some of Dad's things are. I see. Elena's voice was carefully controlled, but inside she was seething. They'd moved fast, faster than she'd expected. But they'd underestimated her, just like they always had. The funeral. Director approached again, this time with a concerned expression. Excuse me, but we need to begin the processional to the cemetery. The hearse is ready. As the family gathered for the final goodbye, Elena found herself walking alone behind the casket. Her siblings had clustered together, their spouses and children forming a protective barrier around them. She could hear them whispering, making plans, dividing up their father's legacy before he was even in the ground. The rain had stopped by the time they reached Graceland Cemetery, but the sky remained gray and threatening. Elena stood at the edge of the grave, watching as they lowered Roberto Martinez into the earth that had made him wealthy. He'd started with nothing, building an empire from concrete and steel, sweat and determination. Now his children were circling that empire like sharks. Elena, Marcus said softly as the ceremony ended. We need to talk, tonight, at Dad's house. I don't have a key anymore, remember? Elena replied. We'll let you in, Carmen said. 7 o'clock. We need to figure out how to handle this safe situation. Elena nodded, but she was already thinking. Ahead. Her father's note had mentioned the bottom drawer of his desk. If her siblings had changed the locks, they probably hadn't thought to secure the individual rooms. And Elena knew something they didn't. She still had the spare key to the back door that Roberto had given her years ago, back when she used to drop by unannounced with groceries for Sunday dinner. As the family dispersed, Elena lingered by the grave. She pulled out her father's note and read it again, focusing on the part about the combination. The date she'd graduated from social work school. May 15th, 2019. 05-15-19. She smiled for the first time since her father's death. Roberto Martinez had always been sentimental about the important moments, even when he pretended not to be. He'd been at her graduation, sitting in the back row, trying not to cry when she walked across the stage. It had been one of the few times she'd seen him truly proud of her choices. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her siblings thought they were so clever, changing locks and making plans. But they'd forgotten the most important thing about Roberto Martinez. He'd always been 10 steps ahead of everyone else. And apparently, he'd made sure Elena was too. As she walked back to her car, Elena could feel the weight of the brass key in her purse. Whatever was in that desk drawer, her father had wanted her to find it. And whatever was in that safe, he'd made sure she'd be the one to open it. The game was just beginning, and Elena finally had a reason to play. The November rain had turned to sleet by the time Elena sat in her Honda Civic across the street from her childhood home, watching the shadows move behind the familiar windows. The 3-story brick house on Ashland Avenue had been Roberto's pride and joy, a symbol of how far he'd come from the cramped apartment where he'd raised his family. The house had been his first major purchase after Martinez construction started, turning a real profit, and he'd spent months personally overseeing every detail of the renovation. Elena remembered being 12 years old, watching Roberto tear out walls and install new plumbing, explaining to her why quality materials mattered, why cutting corners always came back to haunt you. "A house isn't just shelter, mija," he'd said, wiping sweat from his forehead with a paint-stained bandana. "It's a legacy. It's proof that you existed, that you built something that will outlast you." Now the house felt like a fortress, with new locks and her siblings' cars lined up in the driveway like guard dogs protecting their treasure. She checked her phone. 11:47 p.m. The family meeting had ended 2 hours ago, and she'd watched from her hiding spot as Marcus, Carmen, and David had filed out one by one, their faces grim in the porch light. Whatever they'd discussed, it hadn't gone well. Elena pulled the brass key from her purse, turning it over in her fingers. The back door key she'd kept was still there on her keychain, worn smooth from years of Sunday dinners and impromptu visits. She'd tested it that afternoon, slipping around to the alley behind the house while her siblings were at the lawyer's office. They'd changed the front locks, but they'd forgotten about the kitchen entrance that Roberto had installed when he'd renovated the house 15 years ago. Typical. They'd grown up in this house, but they'd never really paid attention to its details, the way Elena had. She'd spent countless hours in that kitchen, learning to make Roberto's favorite empanadas, listening to him tell stories about building his first job site, watching him review blueprints at the worn wooden table. The street was quiet now, the kind of Chicago autumn silence that made every footstep sound amplified. Elena pulled on her black wool coat and grabbed a small flashlight from her glove compartment. She'd dressed carefully for this mission. Dark clothes, soft-soled shoes, hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. She felt like a cat burglar, breaking into her own family home. The alley behind the house was darker than she'd expected, illuminated only by a single streetlight 3 houses down. Elena moved carefully, avoiding the patches of broken concrete that she knew would crunch under her feet. The back gate was unlocked, another oversight by her siblings, who'd been focused on the more obvious entry points. Her father's garden was overgrown, the tomato plants he'd been so proud of now brown and withered. Elena felt a pang of sadness as she remembered how Roberto would bring her fresh tomatoes every Sunday, insisting they were better than anything she could buy at the store. He'd been right, of course. He usually was. The garden had been his one indulgence, the place where the hard-nosed businessman became just a man who loved watching things grow. Every spring, he'd spend hours planning what to plant, reading gardening magazines like other people read stock reports. "Food tastes better when you grow it yourself," he'd always said, "when you put your own sweat into the soil." Elena had never understood the appeal until after her mother died, when she'd started helping Roberto with the garden as a way to spend time together without having to talk about the grief that consumed them both. Those quiet Sunday mornings, working side by side among the tomatoes and peppers, had been some of their most peaceful moments together. The back door key slid into the lock like it had been waiting for her. Elena held her breath as she turned it, praying the mechanism wouldn't squeak. Roberto had always been meticulous about home maintenance, and the door opened silently. The kitchen was exactly as she remembered it. The same avocado green appliances from the 1980s that Roberto had refused to replace. The same wooden table, where he'd balanced his checkbook every Sunday night. The same smell of coffee and Old Spice that seemed permanently embedded in the walls. The refrigerator was covered with the same collection of family photos, business cards, and grocery lists that had accumulated over the years, though Elena noticed several new pictures she'd never seen before. Photos of Roberto with a woman she didn't recognize, both of them smiling in ways that suggested an intimacy she'd never suspected. The woman was beautiful, probably in her 60s, with silver-streaked hair and laugh lines around her eyes. In one photo, she and Roberto were dancing at what looked like a wedding. In another, they were sitting on a beach somewhere, Roberto's arm around her shoulders, both of them looking relaxed and happy. Elena felt a shock of surprise, and something that might have been jealousy. How had Roberto managed to have a whole relationship that none of his children knew about? Elena closed the door behind her and stood still for a moment, listening. The house was silent, except for the familiar creaking of old pipes and the distant hum of the refrigerator. She'd grown up with these sounds. They were as familiar as her own heartbeat. She made her way through the kitchen and into the hallway, her flashlight beam dancing across family photos that chronicled decades of Martinez history. There was her quinceañera picture, Roberto beaming, beside her in his best suit. Marcus's wedding photo, where he looked young and hopeful before politics had hardened him. Carmen's graduation from UCLA, the pride on Roberto's face unmistakable despite his attempts to look stern. The home office was at the back of the house, behind the living room. Elena had always thought of it as her father's sanctuary, the place where he planned construction projects, managed his business, and retreated when family arguments got too heated. The door was closed but not locked. Elena slipped inside and closed the door behind her, then drew the heavy curtains before turning on her flashlight. The room was exactly as Roberto had left it. Papers scattered across the massive oak desk, blueprints rolled up in the corner, the smell of his Cuban cigars still faint in the air. The painting of the Virgin Mary hung on the wall behind the desk, just as Carmen had described. It was beautiful. A reproduction of a colonial Mexican piece that Roberto had bought during a trip to visit his cousins in Guadalajara. Elena had always found it slightly unsettling, the way the Virgin's eyes seemed to follow her around the room. But she wasn't here for the safe yet. First, she needed to find what Roberto had hidden in his desk. The bottom drawer was locked, but the brass key fit perfectly. Inside, Elena found a manila folder labeled Elena Only, in Roberto's distinctive handwriting. Her heart raced as she opened it. The folder contained photocopies of bank statements, property deeds, and business documents, but it was the handwritten letter on top that made Elena's hands shake. Mia, if you're reading this, then you found the key, and you're smart enough to come alone. I always knew you were the smartest of my children, even if you chose to help people instead of make money. Maybe that's why you're the smartest. Your brothers and sister think they know what's in my safe. They think they know what I'm worth. They don't. For the past 5 years, I've been moving assets, creating trusts, protecting what I built from the vultures I raised. Marcus thinks he's entitled to my business because he's the oldest. He's forgotten that I disowned him the day he voted against the affordable housing project on the South Side, the one that would have given families like ours a chance. Politics made him forget where he came from. David thinks he deserves everything because he stayed to work for me. What he doesn't know is that I've been watching him skim money from job sites for 3 years. I have receipts, bank records, everything. I kept him around because he's my son, but I never trusted him with the real money. Carmen thinks she's smarter than all of us because she went to California and married rich. She's been trying to convince me to sell the business and retire to Florida. What she doesn't know is that her husband has been calling me for months, asking about my liquid assets. They're broke, mija. That big house in Beverly Hills, it's mortgaged to the hilt. You're the only one who never asked me for anything. You're the only one who visited because you wanted to see me, not because you needed something. You're the only one I trust. The safe combination is 05-15-19, just like I wrote before. But here's what your siblings don't know. There are 2 safes. The one behind the Virgin Mary is a decoy. It contains some cash, some jewelry, enough to keep them busy fighting over scraps. The real safe is behind the bookshelf on the north wall. Press the spine of the red leather book. Don Quixote, your favorite when you were little. remember how you used to make me read it to you? Inside the real safe, you'll find the documents that transfer 60% of my estate to you. The business, the properties, the investments, most of it is yours. I've left your siblings enough to live comfortably, but not enough to destroy what I built. There's also something else in there. Something that will explain why I had to do this. Why I couldn't. Trust them with the truth. Use this power wisely, mija. And remember, sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones who'll hurt you the worst. Con amor y respeto. Papa Elena read the letter 3 times before the full implications sank in. 60%. Her father had left her controlling, interest in everything, the construction company, the commercial properties, the investment accounts that her siblings had been salivating over. She looked up at the bookshelf he'd mentioned. There it was, the red leather copy of Don Quixote that she'd made him read over and over when she was 8 years old. She'd been obsessed with the story of the idealistic knight fighting impossible battles, never realizing that her father saw something of himself in the tale. Elena pressed the spine of the book and heard a soft click. A section of the bookshelf swung inward, revealing a hidden recess with a second safe. This one much larger and more sophisticated than anything she'd expected. The combination worked on the first try. Inside, Elena found stacks of documents, USB drives, and a smaller envelope labeled, "The Truth About Your Siblings." But it was the framed photograph that made her gasp. It was a picture of her father with a woman she didn't recognize. A beautiful Latina woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. They were standing in front of a house Elena had never seen, both of them looking happy in a way she'd rarely seen Roberto look. On the back of the photo, in Roberto's handwriting, Maria Elena Vasquez, 1987-2023. The love of my life. Elena's namesake. Elena's world tilted. Her father had been in a relationship, a serious one by the look of it, and none of them had known. The woman had died recently, which explained the sadness Elena had noticed in Roberto's final months, the way he'd seemed to withdraw from the family. She opened the envelope labeled, "The Truth About Your Siblings," with trembling hands. Inside were bank statements, photographs, and what appeared to be a private investigator's report. Marcus hadn't just voted against the affordable housing project. He'd been paid to vote against it by a developer who wanted to build luxury condos instead. The payoff had been disguised as a campaign contribution, but Roberto had uncovered the truth. David's theft was worse than Roberto had initially described. He'd been systematically skimming from job sites, falsifying invoices, and selling construction materials on the side. The total amount was over $200,000. Carmen's situation was exactly as Roberto had described, but worse. Her husband had gambling debts, and they'd been planning to convince Roberto to make Carmen his primary heir, so they could sell the business immediately after his death. Elena sank into Roberto's leather chair, overwhelmed by the weight of what she'd discovered. Her siblings weren't just greedy, they were criminals, and they'd been planning to cut her out entirely. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus. "Meeting tomorrow at 2 p.m., bringing a locksmith for the safe. Time to settle this." Elena smiled grimly. Let them bring their locksmith. Let them crack open the decoy safe and fight over the contents. She had something much better. She had the truth, and she had the power to use it. But first, she needed to understand everything. She gathered the documents, USB drives, and photographs, stuffing them into her oversized purse. Tomorrow's meeting was going to be very different from what her siblings expected. As she prepared to leave, Elena took one last look around Roberto's office. On his desk, she noticed a small framed photo she'd somehow missed before. A picture of the two of them from last Christmas, Roberto's arm around her shoulders, both of them laughing at something Carmen had said. On the back, in Roberto's handwriting, "My greatest achievement." Elena felt tears prick her eyes as she carefully tucked the photo into her purse alongside the other documents. Roberto Martinez had been a complicated man, demanding, sometimes harsh, fiercely protective of what he'd built. But he'd also been a father who'd recognized that love wasn't about blood or obligation. It was about trust, respect, and seeing the best in someone even when they couldn't see it in themselves. Tomorrow, she would honor that trust. And her siblings were going to learn that underestimating Elena Martinez had been the biggest mistake of their lives. Elena arrived at the family home at exactly 1:55 p.m., carrying a leather briefcase that had belonged to her father and wearing her most professional navy suit. She'd spent the morning at a copy center, making multiple sets of all the documents she'd found, and then at her lawyer's office, reviewing her options. Jennifer Walsh, her attorney, had been both impressed and concerned by the evidence Elena had uncovered. "This is enough to send all three of them to prison," Jennifer had said, spreading the documents across her conference table. "Marcus could face corruption charges, conspiracy, possibly racketeering if we can prove a pattern. David's looking at felony embezzlement, tax evasion, potentially organized crime connections if those gambling debts are to the wrong people. Carmen might be harder to prosecute directly, but conspiracy to defraud and accessory charges are definitely possible." Elena had stared at the legal documents, feeling the weight of her siblings' futures in her hands. "I don't want to destroy them," she'd said finally. "I want them to have a chance to be better." "That's admirable," Jennifer had replied. "But you need to be prepared for the possibility that they won't take that chance. People who've crossed these kinds of lines don't usually find their way back easily." Now, standing at Roberto's front door, Elena hoped her lawyer was wrong. The game was about to change dramatically, and she wanted to be prepared for every possible move her siblings might make. But she also wanted to believe that somewhere underneath all the greed and betrayal, the people she'd grown up with were still salvageable. Marcus answered the door, his politician's smile firmly in place. "Elena, good to see you. Everyone's here." The living room had been transformed into a war room. Carmen sat at the dining table with Mr. Henderson, the family lawyer, and a man Elena didn't recognize, presumably the locksmith Marcus had mentioned. David paced near the window, his nervousness obvious in the way he kept checking his phone and running his hands through his hair. "Elena, meet Tony Marcelli," Marcus said, gesturing to the locksmith. "He's the best safecracker in Chicago. Tony, this is our sister Elena." Tony nodded politely. He was a small, wiry man with intelligent eyes and hands that looked like they could perform surgery. "Ma'am, I've been looking at your father's safe. It's a good one. Military grade, like Mr. Henderson said. But I can get it open. Might take a few hours, and it won't be cheap." "How much?" Carmen asked immediately. $5,000, plus parts. If I need to drill." Elena watched her siblings exchange glances. $5,000 was nothing compared to what they thought they'd find inside, but she could see them calculating anyway. Old habits. "Before we start drilling," Elena said calmly, "I think we should talk." She set her briefcase on the coffee table and clicked it open. The sound seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet room. "I found some interesting documents in Dad's office," Elena continued, pulling out the first folder. "Documents that I think might change how we approach this whole situation." Marcus's political instincts kicked in immediately. "What kind of documents?" "The kind that explain why Dad was so secretive in his final months." Elena pulled out the private investigator's report and set it on the table. "The kind that show he knew exactly what each of you had been doing." The room went silent. Elena could practically hear her siblings' hearts racing. "Elena," Carmen said, carefully, "what are you talking about?" Elena opened the folder and pulled out the bank statements showing David's theft. "I'm talking about the $200,000 David has been stealing from job sites over the past 3 years. David's face went white. That's not... Dad had receipts, David, bank records, everything." Elena's voice was steady, professional. He knew about the inflated invoices, the material sales. All of it. She turned to Marcus. And he knew about the developer who paid you to vote against the affordable housing project on the South Side. $50,000, disguised as a campaign contribution. Marcus's politician's mask slipped. Elena, you don't understand the complexities of local politics. I understand corruption, Elena interrupted. Dad understood it too. He was disgusted by it. Finally, she turned to Carmen. And Dad knew that you and Richard are broke. He knew about the gambling debts, the second mortgage on your Beverly Hills house, the fact that you've been planning to sell his business the moment you inherited it. Carmen's perfectly composed facade cracked. How could he possibly know? Because he hired a private investigator, Elena said simply. Because he stopped trusting his own children. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena could see the wheels turning in her siblings' heads, trying to figure out how much she knew, how much she could prove, what this meant for their carefully laid plans. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat. Ms. Martinez, these are serious allegations. If you have documentation, I have everything. Elena pulled out a USB drive. Bank records, photographs, witness statements, audio recordings. Dad was very thorough. She stood up and walked to the painting of the Virgin Mary. But before we discuss the legal implications of what my siblings have been doing, why don't we see what's actually in this safe? Elena pulled the painting aside, revealing the safe underneath. Tony the locksmith looked confused. I thought you said you didn't have the combination, he said to Marcus. We don't, Marcus replied, but his voice was uncertain now. Elena smiled. I do. She turned to the safe and entered the combination. 05 15 to 19. The safe opened with a soft click. Inside, exactly as Roberto had promised, were some cash bundles, a few pieces of jewelry, and a manila envelope labeled, "For my children." That's it? David asked, his voice cracking with disappointment. Elena pulled out the envelope and opened it. Inside was a note in Roberto's handwriting. To my children, if you're reading this, then you've probably spent the last few days plotting how to divide up my estate. I hope you're proud of yourselves. This safe contains enough money for each of you to live comfortably for a year. Consider it a gift and a test. If you can learn to work together, to trust each other, to remember that family is more important than money, then perhaps you'll be worthy of the real inheritance. If not, then Elena already has what she needs to protect what I built. The choice is yours. Roberto Martinez Elena watched her siblings' faces as they processed this information. She could see the moment when they realized they'd been outmaneuvered. Elena, Marcus said slowly. What did Dad mean about you having what you need? Elena walked to the bookshelf and pressed the spine of Don Quixote. The hidden safe swung open, revealing the much larger repository of documents and evidence. He meant this, Elena said, pulling out the trust documents. The real will, which leaves me controlling interest in all his assets, the evidence of your various crimes, and the power to decide what happens next. Carmen stood up abruptly. This is impossible. We're his children too. We have rights. You have the right to remain silent, Elena said calmly, because if this evidence goes to the police, you'll all be facing criminal charges. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Elena could see her siblings doing the math, calculating their exposure, trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. What do you want? Marcus asked finally. His politician's instincts told him that everyone had a price. Everyone wanted something. Elena sat back down and looked at each of her siblings in turn. I want the truth. I want to know why you thought you could steal from Dad, lie to him, manipulate him, and then fight over his grave before he was even cold. Elena, you don't understand, David said desperately. The business is complicated. Dad was old-fashioned. He didn't understand modern cash flow management. You mean he didn't understand that you were stealing from him? It wasn't stealing, David's voice cracked. I was going to pay it back. I just needed... You needed to fund your gambling addiction, Elena said, pulling out another document. Dad knew about that too. The poker games, the sports betting, the loan sharks you owe money to. David sank into a chair, his face in his hands. Elena turned to Marcus. And you. Dad was so proud when you got elected to city council. He thought you were going to make a difference, help people like us. Instead, you sold out to the highest bidder. Politics is about compromise, Marcus said weakly. Sometimes you have to make deals. This wasn't a deal. This was corruption. You took money to vote against housing for working families like ours used to be. Finally, Elena faced Carmen. And you. Dad always said you were the smartest of us. He was so proud when you graduated from UCLA, when you moved to California, when you married Richard. He thought you'd made it. He never knew that you were planning to sell his life's work to pay for your husband's gambling debts. Carmen's mask finally fell completely. Elena, please. You don't understand what it's like. The pressure, the expectations. Richard's business failed, and we're drowning in debt. I just thought, you thought Dad was a piggy bank you could break open when you needed money. The room fell silent again. Elena could see the weight of their actions finally hitting her siblings. They'd been so focused on the money, on their own problems, that they'd forgotten Roberto was a person who loved them, who'd built everything he had to give them a better life. So, what happens now? Marcus asked quietly. Elena closed the briefcase and stood up. Now you have a choice. You can accept the inheritance Dad left you, which is generous, considering what you've done. You can pay back what you've stolen, Marcus and David. You can get help for your addictions and your debts. You can try to be the people Dad raised you to be. And if we don't? Carmen asked. Then I turn this evidence over to the police, the IRS, and the State Ethics Committee. Marcus loses his seat and probably goes to prison. David faces embezzlement charges. Carmen, well, technically you haven't committed any crimes yet, but your husband has, and conspiracy charges are always possible. Elena picked up her briefcase and headed for the door. You have 24 hours to decide. After that, I'm assuming you've chosen the hard way. Elena, wait, David called out. We're still family. Doesn't that mean anything? Elena stopped at the door and turned back. Family means everything to me, David. That's why this breaks my heart. Dad trusted you with his business. He trusted Marcus with his pride. He trusted Carmen with his love. And you all betrayed that trust for money. She opened the door, then paused. There's one more thing. Dad wasn't alone in his final years. He had someone who loved him, someone who made him happy. Her name was Maria Elena Vasquez, and she died 3 months ago. That's why he was so sad, why he seemed to withdraw from us. He was grieving, and none of us noticed because we were too busy plotting how to spend his money. The devastation on her siblings' faces was complete. They'd been so focused on Roberto's wealth that they'd missed his humanity entirely. I'll be in touch tomorrow, Elena said. Use the time to figure out who you want to be. As she walked to her car, Elena felt a mix of sadness and relief. She'd won, but victory felt hollow when it came at the cost of her family's integrity. Roberto had been right about one thing. Sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones who'll hurt you the worst. But he'd also been right about something else. She was stronger than she'd ever imagined, and she was ready to protect what he'd built. Not just the business and the money, but the values and principles that had made Roberto Martinez more than just a successful contractor. The real inheritance wasn't the money. It was the responsibility to do better than the generation before her, and Elena was ready to carry that burden. 3 months later, Elena sat in the conference room of Martinez Construction, looking out at the Chicago skyline that her father had helped shape. The view from the 20th floor of the building he'd constructed 15 years ago never failed to remind her of how far the family had come, and how far they still had to go. She could see several of Roberto's buildings from this window: the Mercado Plaza shopping center on Western Avenue, the affordable housing complex on Pilsen Street, the community center on 18th Street that had been his personal pet project. Each building told a story about Roberto's evolution as a businessman and as a man. The early projects had been purely commercial, strip malls and small office buildings designed to generate maximum profit with minimum risk. But as Martinez construction had grown more successful, Roberto had started taking on projects that mattered to him personally: affordable housing for working families, community centers in underserved neighborhoods, schools and libraries that would serve the immigrant communities he'd grown up in. "Your father understood something that most developers never figure out," Elena's architect friend Luis had told her recently. "He realized that buildings aren't just investments, they're part of the fabric of people's lives. The grocery store, where a family shops for 20 years, the apartment where a young couple starts their life together, the community center where kids learn to play basketball, those places shape who people become." The mahogany table was spread with architectural plans, financial reports, and legal documents. Across from her sat Marcus, David, and Carmen, all looking somewhat subdued, but cleaner than they had in months. David had completed a 30-day treatment program for gambling addiction. Marcus had resigned from the city council and was working as a project manager for a nonprofit housing organization. Carmen had moved back to Chicago with her daughters after filing for divorce from Richard. "The Henderson project is back on track," David reported, his voice steadier than it had been since their confrontation 3 months ago. "We'll finish on schedule and under budget. The client is happy." Elena nodded, making a note in her leather-bound planner, the same kind Roberto had used for decades. "Good. What about the South Side housing development?" Marcus looked up from his own notes. "The city approved our proposal. Groundbreaking is scheduled for next month. We'll be building 150 units of affordable housing, just like Dad originally wanted. And the financing? Secured through the Martinez Foundation," Carmen answered. She'd been managing the charitable arm of the business that Elena had established, using part of Roberto's estate to fund community development projects. "We're also partnering with 3 other local contractors to ensure the project creates jobs for neighborhood residents." Elena smiled. It was the first time in months that she'd felt genuinely hopeful about her family's future. The path here hadn't been easy. After her ultimatum 3 months ago, her siblings had initially tried to fight her legally. Marcus had hired an expensive lawyer to contest the will. Carmen had threatened to go to the media with claims that Elena had manipulated their dying father. David had simply disappeared for 2 weeks, drinking himself into a stupor at a casino in Atlantic City. But the evidence Elena possessed was overwhelming, and eventually, reality had set in. Marcus's lawyer had advised him that fighting the will would only guarantee criminal prosecution. Carmen's accountant had explained that her financial situation was so dire that even a small inheritance was better than nothing. And David had been arrested for public intoxication in Atlantic City, spending 3 days in jail before Elena had bailed him out. The turning point had come when Elena had shown them the photographs she'd found in Roberto's safe, pictures of their father with Maria Elena Vasquez, smiling in ways they'd never seen him smile. The realization that they'd been so focused on his money that they'd completely missed his happiness had shattered something inside each of them. "He was in love," Carmen had whispered, staring at a photo of Roberto and Maria dancing at what appeared to be a wedding. "Look how happy he looks." "We never even asked him how he was doing," Marcus had added, his voice thick with guilt. "After Mom died, we just assumed he'd be alone forever." David had been the most affected. He used to ask me about my personal life, about whether I was seeing anyone, whether I was happy. I thought he was just being nosy. He was trying to connect with me, and I shut him down every time. That's when Elena had made her proposal. Instead of turning them over to the authorities, she would give them a chance to redeem themselves. David would get help for his gambling addiction and work to pay back every penny he'd stolen. Marcus would resign from politics and dedicate himself to community service. Carmen would return to Chicago and help manage the family's charitable foundation. In exchange, they would receive their inheritances, not the controlling interest they'd plotted to steal, but enough to live comfortably while rebuilding their lives and their relationships with each other. It hadn't been easy. David had relapsed twice before finally committing to recovery. Marcus had struggled with the loss of political power and prestige. Carmen had gone through a bitter divorce while trying to rebuild her relationship with her teenage daughters, who'd been caught in the middle of their parents' financial disasters. But slowly, gradually, they'd started to become a family again. "There's something else we need to discuss," Elena said, pulling out a folder she'd been saving for this moment. The Maria Elena Vasquez Memorial Scholarship. Her siblings looked up with interest. They'd all been curious about the woman who'd captured their father's heart. But Elena had been protective of Maria's memory, sharing only basic details about her life and her relationship with Roberto. "I've been in touch with Maria's daughter, Sophia," Elena continued. "She's a social worker in Los Angeles about my age. She and Dad were close. He helped pay for her education, and she visited him every few months." Elena pulled out a photograph and placed it on the table. It showed Roberto, Maria, Elena, and a woman who looked remarkably like Elena herself, all sitting around a dinner table, laughing at something off camera. "This was taken last Christmas," Elena said quietly. "Dad wanted us to meet, but Maria got sick before we could arrange it. She died in February, and Dad was heartbroken. That's why he seemed so distant in his final months." Carmen reached for the photo, studying it carefully. "She looks like you, Elena. Same eyes, same smile. Dad said that's why he named me after her," Elena replied. "He met Maria when I was born, and he said seeing her hold me was like watching two parts of his heart come together." Marcus cleared his throat. "What about the scholarship?" "Sophia and I want to establish a scholarship fund for young people from working-class families who want to go into social work or community development. We'll fund it through the foundation, and we'll name it after Maria." Elena pulled out the scholarship criteria she and Sophia had developed. Recipients will have to demonstrate financial need, academic achievement, and a commitment to serving their communities, just like Maria did, just like Dad taught us to do. David nodded slowly. Dad would like that. He always said the best investment was in people. "There's more," Elena said. "Sophia wants to move to Chicago. She's been offered a position with the city's housing authority, working on the same affordable housing initiatives that Dad supported. I'd like to offer her a place on our board of directors." The room was quiet for a moment as her siblings processed this information. Elena could see them struggling with the idea of bringing an outsider into their family business, even someone who'd been important to Roberto. "She's not really an outsider, is she?" Carmen said finally. "If Dad loved her mother, if he considered Sophia family, then she's our family too," Marcus finished. "I'd like to meet her." Elena smiled. "She's flying in next week for the scholarship announcement. You'll all have a chance to get to know her." Over the next hour, they reviewed the quarterly financial reports, discussed upcoming projects, and planned the foundation's activities for the rest of the year. It felt surreal to Elena. 6 months ago, they'd been at each other's throats over Roberto's money. Now they were working together to honor his memory and continue his legacy. As the meeting wound down, David stood up and walked to the window. "You know what's funny?" he said, looking out at the skyline. "All those buildings Dad built, all that money he made, none of it mattered as much as we thought it did." "What do you mean?" Elena asked. "I mean, we spent so much time fighting over his legacy that we almost destroyed it. The real legacy isn't the money or the buildings. It's what he taught us about family, about taking care of each other, about using what you have to help other people." Carmen nodded. "I keep thinking about that note he left in the fake safe, about family being more important than money. We came so close to proving him wrong. But we didn't, Marcus said firmly. We're here. We're working together. We're trying to be better than we were. Elena felt a warmth in her chest that she hadn't experienced since Roberto's death. For the first time in months, she felt like they were truly siblings again, not just business partners or reluctant heirs. There's one more thing, she said, reaching into her briefcase. I found this in Dad's desk last week. She pulled out a sealed envelope marked, "To be opened, 1 year after my death." Should we wait? Carmen asked. Elena shook her head. He's been gone 6 months. I think he'd want us to read it now, while we're all together. She opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper in Roberto's handwriting. My dear children, if you're reading this together, then you've chosen love over money, family over greed. I'm proud of you. If Elena is reading this alone, then I'm sorry I couldn't teach the rest of you what really matters. Take care of yourself, mija. You deserve better than them. I hope you've met Sofia by now. She's a good girl, just like her mother was a good woman. Treat her like family, because that's what she is. The business will prosper if you remember that. Success isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in the lives you improve, the communities you strengthen, the families you help build. Don't mourn me too long. I lived a full life. I loved deeply. And I leave behind children who will make the world better than they found it. That's all any parent can ask for. Con amor eterno. Papa Elena felt tears running down her cheeks as she finished reading. Around the table, her siblings were similarly affected. Marcus was wiping his eyes with his sleeve. Carmen was crying openly. David had his head in his hands. He knew, Carmen whispered. He knew we'd figure it out. He believed in us, Marcus added, even when we didn't believe in ourselves. Elena carefully folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. This stays in the family safe, she said, for our children to read someday. As they prepared to leave, David stopped at the door. Elena, I need to say something. What I did, stealing from Dad, lying to him, there's no excuse for it. But thank you for giving me a chance to make it right. We all made mistakes, Elena replied. The important thing is learning from them. Carmen hugged her tightly. I'm sorry I doubted you. Dad chose well. Marcus was the last to leave. You know, he said, I used to think Dad was too sentimental, too old-fashioned. I thought his ideas about family and loyalty were outdated. I was wrong. Elena watched her siblings leave, then stood alone in the conference room for a few minutes, looking out at the city Roberto had helped build. Tomorrow, she would meet Sofia Vasquez for the first time. Next week, they would break ground on the affordable housing project. Next month, they would award the first Maria Elena Vasquez Memorial Scholarships. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. The reporter from the Tribune is here for your interview about the foundation. Elena smiled and gathered her papers. 6 months ago, she'd been a social worker living paycheck to paycheck, watching her family tear itself apart over money. Now she was the head of a construction company and a charitable foundation, working to heal both her family and her community. Roberto had been right about one thing. The real inheritance wasn't the money. It was the responsibility to do better, to be better, to use what you'd been given to lift up others. As she walked toward the elevator, Elena felt her father's presence in the building he'd constructed, in the company he'd built, in the values he'd instilled in her even when she'd been too young to understand them. The safe had been opened. The combination had been trust, love, and the patience to let people become who they were meant to be. And finally, after months of pain and betrayal and healing, the Martinez family had learned to open their hearts the same way. Roberto would have been proud. Epilogue 1 year later, Elena stood in the community center that Martinez Construction had built in the heart of Chicago's South Side. The room was filled with families who'd moved into the affordable housing units, young people who'd received scholarships from the foundation, and community leaders who'd partnered with the company on various projects. The walls were decorated with photos documenting the construction process, showing Roberto in his hard hat alongside the workers, his face beaming with pride as each phase of the project was completed. The community center had been Roberto's dream project, something he'd talked about for years but never had the time or resources to pursue. It included a full gymnasium, computer lab, after-school tutoring programs, and a commercial kitchen where families could take cooking classes and seniors could gather for lunch. The building had cost Martinez Construction nearly $2 million, money that could have gone toward profitable developments, but Elena had insisted on completing her father's vision. He used to drive by this empty lot every day on his way to work, Elena had told the architect. He'd say, "Someday, when we have enough money, we're going to build something here that the whole neighborhood can use." Well, now we have enough money, and it's time to build it. Sofia Vasquez stood beside her, no longer a stranger, but a sister, in every way that mattered. The integration of Sofia into the family had been easier than Elena had expected. Marcus, David, and Carmen had all embraced her warmly, perhaps recognizing that she represented a part of Roberto they'd never known, the man who could love again after loss, who could find joy in simple pleasures, who could build relationships based on affection rather than obligation or business advantage. Sofia's 4-year-old son, Roberto, named after the grandfather he'd never met, tugged at Elena's hand. "Tia Elena, when can we see the big buildings again?" Elena smiled and picked him up. "After the party, mijo. I'll show you all the buildings your abuelo built." Across the room, she could see her siblings working the crowd in their own ways. David was deep in conversation with a group of construction workers, explaining the company's new profit-sharing program. Marcus was talking to city council members about expanding the affordable housing initiative. Carmen was surrounded by scholarship recipients, helping them navigate college applications and career planning. They'd all found their ways to honor Roberto's memory, each using their unique skills to continue his work. The family business had never been more successful, but more importantly, it had never been more meaningful. As the evening wound down, Elena found herself standing outside the community center with Sofia, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Sofia said. "How different things might have been if our parents had gotten married." Elena considered this. "We might have grown up as sisters. But then again, maybe we wouldn't have had to learn the hard way that family isn't just about blood. It's about choice, about commitment, about showing up for each other when it matters." Sofia nodded. "Mom used to say that the best families aren't born, they're built. One day, one choice, one act of love at a time." Elena looked back at the community center, where her siblings were still talking with neighbors and friends, building relationships that would last for decades. Tomorrow they would return to their work, constructing buildings, managing investments, awarding scholarships, serving their community. But tonight, they were simply a family that had learned to choose love over money, trust over suspicion, hope over fear. Roberto Martinez had built an empire of concrete and steel. But his greatest construction project had been his family. Flawed, complicated, sometimes fractured, but ultimately strong enough to support each other's dreams and carry forward his legacy. The safe had been opened. The combination had been revealed. And inside, they'd found something more valuable than money or property or power. They'd found their way back to each other. As Elena and Sofia walked back toward the warmth and light of the community center, Elena felt her father's presence one more time, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a living influence in every choice she made, every life she touched, every day she chose to build something better than what came before. The Martinez family legacy would continue for generations, measured not in dollars or buildings, but in the lives they changed and the communities they served. And that, Elena knew, was exactly what Roberto Martinez had always wanted. The real treasure had never been hidden in a safe. It had been hidden in their hearts, waiting for them to find the courage to open them.